So, hello there, and welcome back to another Night of the Movies podcast. I'm Spy Knight, and in these podcasts, I like talking all things movies and TV, and whatever I want, whenever I want. And in today's podcast, I am reviewing the new Beatles documentary on Disney Plus, which is, of course, Beatles 64. So, let's get into it, shall we? Beatles 64, as what he said, is this new Beatles documentary on Disney Plus, all about the first time the Fab Four, aka the Beatles, went to America in 1964, hence the name of the documentary. And the documentary is directed by Dave Dedesi, hopefully I pronounced that name correctly, and the documentary is produced by Martin Scorsese. Yes, Martin Scorsese, the same person who directed Goodfellas, The Wolf of Wall Street, Taxi Driver, Shutter Island, The King of Comedy, Mean Street, and so on and so on and so on. I mean, just look at the amount of films Martin Scorsese has directed. It's kind of incredible. It's not kind of incredible, it is incredible. And he produced this documentary, which was a bit of a surprise, because I always thought that Martin Scorsese was more of a Stones fan, was more of a Rolling Stones fan, because he uses a lot of Rolling Stones songs in his films. You know, I specifically remember in Casino where he uses Gimme Shelter. So, I was a bit surprised, because normally people say, oh, you're either a Stones fan or you're a Beatles fan, which I don't think is totally the truth, by the way. There are some Stones songs I absolutely love, but clearly, I'm more of a Beatles fan. But anyway, yeah, some people often say that, and I always thought that Scorsese was more of a Stones person, but clearly, because not only did he produce this documentary, he also featured in it. He featured in it interviewing Ringo Starr. And I think in some of the promotional material for this documentary, you saw him interviewing Paul McCartney, though from what I remember, you don't actually see that in the film. But you actually see Martin Scorsese in the documentary, so clearly he enjoys the Beatles as well, which is nice to see. And this documentary is also produced by the two surviving Beatles members, which are of course Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, and Olivia Harrison and Sean Ono Lennon, who are of course related to George Harrison and John Lennon respectively, are both producers on this film as well. And I've spoken about this at length on this channel over the past year, so I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but clearly, I'm a big Beatles fan. There is not a day goes by where I don't listen to a bit of Beatles music. Same with John Williams. Literally, those are the songs. Literally, when I wake up in the morning, I listen to a bit of Beatles and a bit of John Williams, but I'm not going to talk about John Williams in today's podcast. I already did that a couple of weeks back when I reviewed the new John Williams documentary, which is also on Disney Plus. But yeah, not a day goes by when I don't listen to a bit of Beatles music. You know, just this morning, I woke up and I listened to Sexy Sadie. Sexy Sadie, where have you gone? You made a fool of everyone. I can't sing to save my life. And I also listened to a bit of Another Girl, you know. Another Girl. I can't remember the lyrics right now. Put me on the spot. Anyway, you get the point I'm making. I absolutely adore the Beatles so much that whenever a new Beatles thing comes out, I immediately get interested, even if it's just adjacent to the Beatles, like the Paul McCartney and Wings documentary One Hand Clapping, which came out early this year. It came out a couple of months ago now, maybe it only came out a month ago, but anyway, that came out early this year, and that wasn't a Beatles documentary, but because it was all about Paul McCartney, I was interested in it because I love the Beatles so much. And when Midas Man, the film all about Brian Epstein, came out about a couple of weeks ago now, I was interested in that as well, because Brian Epstein was the manager for the Beatles. So you get the point I'm making. Any new Beatles thing that comes out, I immediately get interested in. And when I heard this film was coming out, I was interested. But I'd be lying if I said I was excited, because I feel like we've had a bit too many Beatles things come out recently. Maybe I'm not correct there, but it feels a bit like we have, what with One Hand Clapping, Midas Man, and I know One Hand Clapping wasn't a Beatles thing, but at the same time, though, I sort of consider it as somewhat Beatles, because of course Paul McCartney was involved in it. So I wasn't too excited, because when I sat down to watch this documentary, I was a bit like, okay, here we go again, it's another Beatles documentary. The other reason I wasn't really excited was because as much as I love the Beatles, and I really, really do, I mean, look, I've got Beatles Christmas jump on for today's podcast, I've got loads of Beatles t-shirts that I wear and my reviews that I do, you know, once or twice a week, or maybe even 3 times a week sometimes, and I reviewed the Beatles anthology earlier this year, and I talked about Midas Man earlier this year, and I reviewed One Hand Clapping earlier this year. I talk about the Beatles at length on this channel when I feel like it. You know, when the announcement of the Beatles biopics came out, was it like in February this year? Was it in March this year? Whenever the announcement came out, when I heard that the when the Beatles biopics were in the works, I did a video on that because of my excitement. But, you know, even so, I love the Beatles so much. I am more fascinated by their work from Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band onwards. Don't get me wrong, I'm not interested in their early work, but I find their later work, when they stopped touring and spent more time in the studio, utterly absorbing. And when I heard that this documentary was going to focus on the year they went to America, I was like, oh, you know, we've already seen that covered in the Beatles anthology, and covered pretty well. And we've already seen that covered in the Ron Howard Beatles documentary, 8 Days a Week, the touring years as well. So I was a bit like, do we need to see this story again? Do we need to see this section of Beatles history covered again? But I was still interested and still excited. I wouldn't say I was terribly excited, but I was excited because apparently the documentary was going to have rare footage of the Beatles during 1964 when they were touring America, when they were in America for the first time. Plus the documentary was going to have new interviews from Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr talking about their time in the Beatles during this period, during when they were first going to America. So, you know, that did excite me, seeing new interviews from Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr talking about the Beatles. Always brings a smile on my face, and I did want to see it because I'm a huge Beatles fan. I wasn't highly anticipating it as much as I wanted to. And the Google plot synopsis for this documentary goes as follows. This documentary gives us a look at the band's electrifying 1964 US debut amid fan frenzy, and their unprecedented rise to global superstardom after performing on The Ed Sullivan Show to over 73 million viewers caught in rare behind-the-scenes footage. And that's pretty much all you need to know about this documentary before seeing it. And here's the thing about this documentary. It accomplishes what it sets out to do in spades. I thought this was a very good film for what it is. You know, if you go into this documentary expecting to see all this behind-the-scenes footage of them recording songs from this period, then you're going to be disappointed. And if you are not really a Beatles fan, then I wouldn't recommend watching this documentary. I mean, it does annoy me sometimes, and this is a little tangent here, you know. It does annoy me when people say the Beatles are overrated. If you don't like the Beatles, if the Beatles music just isn't for you, that's fine. But don't say they're overrated, because it's just not true. Whenever somebody says the Beatles are overrated, I want to slap them over the head with a wet fish. And I'm not a violent person, so anyway, going back onto what I was saying. If you're not really a Beatles fan, this documentary isn't for you. But as a Beatles fan, as a huge Beatles fan, I've been a Beatles fan for as long as I can remember, I was sat there eating this documentary up, literally loving it and smiling from moment to moment, seeing all these personal accounts from people who were there when the Beatles first came to America, when they played on the Ed Sullivan Show. And then seeing, you know, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr in present day talk about their experiences. Particularly with Paul McCartney, where you see him in this Beatles museum in New York. I think it's in Brooklyn in New York. Where he's looking over all this old Beatles memorabilia. And just that in itself is poignant. And the way he's talking about it all. It's like, you know, I mean, I can't think of words to describe it. It really was magnetic just to watch Paul McCartney look around this Beatles museum and talk about his experience. And clearly, they only got Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr to do interviews for only for a day for this documentary. But the fact they got them to do new interviews for this documentary, I think adds this layer of authenticity and added this layer of engagement to the film that wouldn't have been there if they didn't do interviews, if they didn't do new interviews for this documentary. But because they did, it makes the documentary engaging, it makes it all the more compelling, and it makes it all the more poignant in those moments when it needs to be poignant as well. Plus, I loved all the exploration into how America received the Beatles in 1964, because although I have seen it being explored before in the Beatles anthology and in 8 Days a Week, the touring years, which both did a very good job exploring this, this period in Beatles history, this film did it in a new light that I hadn't really thought of before. This film talks about how when the Beatles came to America, they were like a light for Americans after the assassination of President JFK. How America was in mourning after the assassination of JFK, and then the Beatles came to America, and they gave Americans this breath of fresh air. They made Americans feel alive again, and how that influenced Beatlemania. And I loved how Beatlemania was explored in this documentary. Furthermore, I loved how we got to see how the Beatles were admired by not only white audiences but black American audiences as well. How you got to see how you saw that black American musicians really admire the Beatles, and how the Beatles admired black American musicians as well. One of the members from the Miracles, a band I'm not overly familiar with, one of the members from the Miracles talks about how they were surprised by the Beatles' love for black American music, how they covered a song from a black American band, and this member of the Miracles was talking about how this was this big moment in music because no big band full of white musicians had done that before. And you also see interviews from the time, from 1964, from black Americans talking about how much they admire the Beatles. And I loved how this documentary explored how the Beatles not only appealed to white audiences but also to black audiences in America as well, and how they tried to bring those audiences together. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. Plus, all the rare footage that you see of the Beatles during 1964 in this documentary is just a joy to watch. If you haven't watched interviews from the Beatles and you were watching or listening to this review today, then you should go and check some interviews from the Beatles out back during that period when they were so witty and funny, and there was this charm about them, this irresistible charm where you were watching them and you couldn't turn away from them because they were so utterly wonderful to watch. They were just such a joy to watch in interviews, and this documentary really shines a light on that in just the best way. And seeing all these interviews from people in present day talking about their own personal experiences with the Beatles, like I've already said, you get one of the members of the Miracles talking about the personal significance of the Beatles coming to America. One of the members of the Ronettes talk about her experience with the Beatles. David Lynch, he talks about his experience seeing the Beatles in America. And then you get some old interviews from George Harrison and John Lennon when they were still around, talking about the effect that Beatlemania had on them. And it was also nice seeing some of the footage from the Beatles anthology remastered in this documentary as well, because there is some footage from the Beatles anthology we used again here. One of the interviews that George Harrison did for the Beatles anthology is used again in this documentary, but it's remastered and it looks pristine, it looks new, and also it adds more to this documentary because you see George Harrison talking about the time that the Beatles first appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, and the fun fact that apparently for like the 10 minutes that the Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan Show performing, crime in America just stopped or something like that. I might be misremembering the fact, but like all the criminal activity in America during the time that the Beatles were first on the Ed Sullivan Show just stopped. Again, the fact might not be that word for word, but it's something around those lines. And it just, yeah, I was watching this documentary and I was really loving it. Again, it's not for people who are not fans of the Beatles. And if you're hoping to see inside the recording session of the Beatles during this time, you're going to be disappointed. And the documentary does lean on the slower side, which won't be for everybody. But I really, really enjoyed it. And I did not expect to. I sat down to watch the documentary, first thing in the morning. As soon as it came out on Disney Plus, about 8 a.m. in the morning on the 29th of November, as soon as this documentary came out, I was sitting down to watch it on Disney Plus. But I wasn't, even so I was sitting down to watch it as soon as it came out, I was not terribly excited about it. And yet I came away from the documentary feeling moved, which I didn't expect because of the way it sort of concludes and because of the exploration that we got into the Beatles' history of this time, because it's from a perspective which I hadn't really thought about before. From a number of perspectives, actually, which I hadn't really thought about before. And there was a layer of poignancy there with the interviews during present day, and I loved all the archival footage that you saw in the documentary as well. And hearing Beatles music alongside seeing Beatles footage during the 1960s, during 1964. Also, as a Beatles fan, you just can't help but smile at that. At least I can't anyway. I loved it. I really did. And I did not expect to. It accomplished what it set out to do in spades. At least I thought it did anyway. And so, all in all, I'm going to say that Beatles 64, I'm going to say that it's I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. There's not really anything I would change about this documentary. I mean, yeah, it leads on the slower side, but I think for what it's trying to do, that works. Yeah. I loved it, and I don't really have anything to say. I don't really have anything else to say because, I mean, just thinking about it now, it's just left me a little speechless. Just thinking about the things you learn in this documentary, how you saw the Beatles fought back against their critics, because even all the way back then there were people saying that Beatles were overrated, and how the Beatles just fought back against their critics, and how the Beatles just kept going, and how they weren't, the crazy artists that you sometimes see nowadays, how they were just normal Liverpool blokes in America making this sensation. I loved it. I know I've already said that before, but I'm going to say it again because I was really surprised by that. And yeah, I do think if you're a Beatles fan, it's worth a watch. I loved it. And so, all in all, as I already said, and as I'm going to say once more, in this podcast today, Beatles 64 is a 9 out of 10 from me. Anyway, guys, that's it for today's podcast. If you have seen Beatles 64, please let me know your thoughts on it in the comment section below. And as always, thanks for watching or listening to this podcast. So if you can hear some sound instruments right now, I don't know where that's coming from. But if if you did enjoy this podcast, don't forget to click down below and like and subscribe. And look forward to many more podcasts and many more videos coming very, very soon on this channel. As I've already said, thank you so much for watching or listening to this podcast. And I suppose this is it. So I will see you guys again soon. But bye for now. Bye.